Welcome, everyone. I'm John Kane, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Backyards and Neighborhoods. The program is on the occasion of Crafting Communities, the current exhibition on view at Asia Art Archive, focused on the biennial Womanifesto initiative, which manifested as a series of events from 1997 through 2008, in which, as the name suggests, centered on women artists and women's experience. I'm also pleased to announce that the Womanifesto archive has been digitized by AAA and will be launching on the website. The format for tonight's program grew out of the process of preparing for the archive, which involved countless hours of digitization on the part of my colleague Ali Wong, but also many exchanges with the Womanifesto organizers, which gradually came to take the form of regular video meetings in which we at AAA would sit down with some of the Womanifesto artists who are currently scattered across Australia, different parts of Asia, and Europe. Like many others around the world who were freshly discovering the wonders and joys of Zoom meetings during this time, we talked about our situation around various lockdowns and quarantines. But we also talked about what was in the archive, mainly the photographs, and we got to hear the stories and relationships, the friendships and the memories, the souvenirs of the goings-on in various backyards and neighborhoods that the archive holds and preserves. In fact, over the course of these exchanges, we also got to experience firsthand how the archive is not only a container or a trace of these relationships and communities, but also can bring people together anew in the act of collective remembering and re-remembering. In the earlier session related to crafting communities on artist residencies, we got to hear Nitaya Uyara and others talk about the importance of Boombanon Farm in the history of Womanifesto. The other important subject, the topic of tonight, concerns the motivations and thinking that went into the evolution of Womanifesto, a process and a project and a process that centered women artists and women's experiences from its start in the mid-1990s until its residency program on the farm in 2008. So tonight we have invited Varsha Nair and Phaptawan Suwannakudt, two of the founders and organizers, together with art historian and thinker Eileen Legaspi-Ramirez, to continue the work of talking and remembering. Before I introduce the three guests, allow me to just acknowledge some people in my own backyard, the crew who worked on Womanifesto with me, so Ali Wong and Garfield Chow, as well as the people who are making tonight's program possible. So Garfield, Helena Halim, Oscar Soy, and Sam Kwok, as well as the Women in Art History Fund, which supported the exhibition and related programs, as well as the archival digitization project. So thank you, Jonathan Jung, Geoffrey Tran, Luc Vehan, Shirazi Hashari, Lisan Gallery, Margie Lau, Deepoon, and Claudine Yi, and for your support, and special thanks to my colleague Alex Seno as well. So in alphabetical order, our guest for tonight, Eileen Legaspi-Ramirez, who is a faculty member of the University of the Philippines Diliman's Department of Art Studies. Her scholarship and writing have been published in Southeast Asia Spaces of the Curatorial, New Histories of Southeast Asian Art, 1945 to 1990, and Southeast of Now, of which she is an editorial board member. She is also an advisory board member of Asia Art Archive and steering committee member of another roadmap school. She is the associate editor of the Visual Arts volume of the Revised Cultural Center of the Philippines Encyclopedia of Philippine Art, and has served as president of the nonprofit arts organization Panawa Sini Bayan. Phaptawan Suwannakudt is an artist who trained in the Thai mural tradition with her father, esteemed painter Phaptawan Suwannakudt. She studied at Silpakorn University and obtained an MFA from the University of Sydney. She has been practicing since the 1980s, and aside from a number of residencies, has also participated in various exhibitions, including Tradisection, Concrete House 1995, Women Imaging Women, Home Body Memory Cultural Center of the Philippines in 1998, El Poder de Narrar, Espai de Art Contemporánea de Castelo Valencia, 2000, 18th Biennale of Sydney, and the inaugural Bangkok Art Biennale of 2018, and also just announced the National Biennial, which is taking place in Australia. Since 1996, she has lived and worked in Sydney. Last but not least, Varsha Nair, who is a Ugandan-born artist whose work encompasses various approaches and genres. From 1995 until 2019, she was based in Bangkok, where she co-founded Womanifesto. Nair has exhibited at many exhibitions and venues, among them Text and Subtext, Contemporary Art and Asian Women, LaSalle, which took place at LaSalle College of Arts and among other places in 2000. Tate Modern, 2006, Still Moving Image, Debbie Art Foundation in 2008, and Code Live in 2008. Her writings have been published in Paradoxa, Art Asia Pacific, and Control Plus P, Journal of Contemporary Art, among other places. She currently resides in Baroda, India, where she graduated from the Faculty of Fine Arts. So, and also just one word of housekeeping, there will be a question and answer. So if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box at any point in time. Okay, so with that, let's begin. So we're here tonight to talk about feminist strategies and communities. And I think one of the things that, that came out of the various conversations that we had over the course of the past few months has been, the evolution of Womanifesto. And it begins somewhat a little before Womanifesto in 1995, but even before that, kind of in the ambiance or the general atmosphere of Thailand in the 80s and 90s. And Phaptawan, since you maybe were maybe more well placed to speak about that, I was wondering if you could say a few words about where the idea for Manifesto came from.
Good evening, everyone. Good day. Good morning. If someone across the world is in the morning zone. I think allow me to indulge myself to talk about work, but that is a reason why I used the model of my work to talk about this, because you will see how my work fits in the art scene, and also it's kind of mirror what happened during the 90s, during the 80s, where when myself was active. Before we go to I have prepared a slide, but before we go to the slide, please allow me to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land, past and present, emerging for the land in which I broadcast. I'd like to acknowledge that. So could I have the slide to start with, please? Thank you. This was the exhibition on the left. It was in year 1989. Before that, I was active as a mural painter. And on the right, it's my style mural painting, but it was painted on top of the ikat matmi silk, and that was actually the piece that I wanted to say to put the tradition and the sarong piece of matmi silk on top. The work was in 1990. My life evolved in the art circle of my father, actually, and he was one of the first group of students from Phaptawan University. My childhood spent in temple. That's why my work looked like traditional temple painting. So this is just to see the background, how my background came from. I did not go to art school. I spent my life around this circle of my father workshop. Next slide, please. So that was the first temple. Before the first temple, that was in 1990, I had done a couple of mural painting, most of the time in public space, like in hotel lobby or in public hall. And that painting, that temple was Wat Si Khom Kham temple in Phayao, 700 kilometers north of Bangkok, and it contained 216 square meters, in which I started from the scratch. There was a background in the front where Angkhan Kalayanapong did not finish his painting, and I was the person who was asked to do the rest. That photo was actually the front cover of Srisan magazine, and it took me by surprise because one day a team of Srisan, including the editor Sukanya Hantrakun and Manit Siwanishapum, who was the photographer, and he took the, he asked for me to take the picture. And the editor decided that it should be the cover, which was still criticism why this woman in the front cover. Next question, next slide, please. And that after the temple was completed and my hair cut short like that, so it's transformed me over the period of 12 months. I commute between Temple and Bangkok in 12 hours long night coach, and that forced me to cut my hair short. So that was to avoid, some kind of advance from other people who think that this single woman was traveling alone. Next slide, please. 5 years later, the first exhibition outside of Temple project, outside my panel painting came Tradisection. Tradisection was held at Concrete House, and it was formed by, it was exhibition participated by 6 women artists and writers, activists. The person who supported us was Jantavipa Apisuk, whom I was introduced by Nitya. I met Nitya earlier. I remember we met at Alliance Française in probably around 1989 or early 1990. That was the time when my temple, I started doing my temple, the temple that I just shown. Then we form a kind of affiliation in terms of, because we are women, during the time when I put my exhibition, when I had my project and exhibition in most of the time charity group like Ban Pak Chuk Chern, which means Women's Shelter House, and or Friends of Women, Phuen Ying. So that's how I, apart from outside the group exhibition that I organized for my own group to exhibit their work, then that was about the activities that I did. So getting to know Nitya and later Jantavipa, Jitima Ponsawek is take me out of that zone, and I was privileged to know Jantavipa because she's the activist who run, empower, and support legal advice for sex workers, which brought me closer to my environment in my childhood, because with my father we moved between rented house and from places to places, and most of the time with the house, such house in Bangkok, with the environment, I got to know friends who are children of sex workers, and I saw them drop off school, and some of them are my close friends. So we formed this exhibition, Tradisection, and Tradisection came from tradition and dissection. And the Thai version of this title is Prapeni and Praweni. Praweni is sexuality, or sex, about sex, and Prapeni is tradition, which I find that was the opportunity to voice what I experienced outside the temple. And I saw a piece, it was my first installation piece. Next slide, please. So this is the installation, the sketch of installation, and to which I hung a piece of sarong above head level, which was taboo for men to go close or underneath. And that was from my experience, that I was humiliated by my own cousin, and he was supposed to use the bathroom, in which I just came out, but I left my sarong hung inside, and he was yelling at me and wanted me to remove the sarong before he used next. So that referred to that. But on the right-hand side, these are participants who wore sarong. Everyone wore sarong, and then we declare the exhibition open. We can talk more later if you want to know about the Tradisection, but we move on to the next slide, please. That exhibition was, among the participants were Nitya, the second on from left, Ming Loparat, and I was on the far right. The far left was Rachada Thanaporn. This was at the first, I remember the very first exhibition of Huan Miro. And Rachada Thanaporn was the managing director at the moment, at that time. And she was very keen to be involved with the group, which by then we we have moved to, or we plan to have the second iteration. And that was one of the meeting, and we went to do the meeting at the Chulalongkorn Art Gallery within Chulalongkorn University. Next slide, please. Relate to the exhibition and the plan that we wanted to do the second exhibition. It was planned, and Ming Loparat got the name Womanifesto, but actually we did not go very far. in terms of financial support, or get even anything to move on. The venue were not familiar with our group, perhaps, or our approach was not right. I don't know what happened. Now that brings to this slide. It's called Portrait of the Artist as a Thai Woman. It was shot and published in 1996 in March to commemorate the International Women's Days. However, I can name all these artists, including myself here on the left. Pinari was at the back on the left, and Surojana on the right. Siwan Jen Hatakankit was in the middle, and Kanya Jalan Supukun was on the right. By that time, it was 1996, but all these women faces were from the 80s. So it's same faces during over the decades. Womanifesto supposed to bring some, some new missions, new activities, but it did not happen. And that was in March. In April, I left to Sydney. I did not see the light or the progress afterward. It happened and took place during the second half of the decade in 1990s, where we saw her group in which Onanong Prinsley was part of, one of them, one of the participants. Also Taingam Kuktabut. I have not seen, I was not there to witness that. I went back up. I left for Sydney. I have been in Sydney for 24 years now. Next slide, please. So in 1996, first day when I arrived, I started this series. And I sent this series, which was called Naripun, to participate in the first Womanifesto. The first Womanifesto took place at Banja Praya in Bangkok in 1997 and achieved by Nitya Ari Warakun and Varsha Nair, to whom I am forever grateful. That keep on with the Womanifesto, and the Womanifesto remained the platform for women artists across the world. Now, if I can say that, let me please allow me to talk a little bit about this series. The Naripun was actually the narrative from Thai mythology, and actually is commonly seen in the decoration ornament in temple window panel or door panel. And the narrative was there was a gold fruit tree, which was the tree bear fruit into gold shape, and the goals only last, the life of this fruit not gold, lasts about 16 days, and then rotten, and but some, if they survive by people who come across and take them to fulfill that desire. So next slide, please. I painted this Naripun, and in the series was the girl whom I met in front of that Wat Si Khom Kam, the earlier temple that I show you. The first few in the temple. This girl waits the table at noodle stall, in which I went to have my lunch or early dinner there. she was sold among other girls by their own parents in that village. Apparently to a syndicate or a sex brothel somewhere. It was only when I settled in Sydney that I could talk or paint and depict the story of this girl. And this girl seemed to keep going, deprecating herself. The child, selling their own children had stopped since, with the help of Member of Parliament, local and everywhere. But I guess, unfortunately, it took place somewhere else, like in the neighboring country. So is there any more slides left? I like to end with the second series, which was My Mother Was a Nun. In the middle is the juxtaposition, and it's the formula in which we see in every temple. But instead of assemble of angel who came and pay respect to Buddha, it was my mother dressed as a nun. On the left, it was her portrait as a nun, and on the right is a different posture. She left to become a nun after her after she gave birth to her youngest daughter, my youngest sister. When I gave birth to my daughter, my mother came to support me. She was at the same age when I gave birth, when she went to become a nun. And I paint this series after she had gone back, after she came and visit with my birth. She went back, so I painted this from the memory. This was it. I guess back to the my introduction about I can only mirror the experience and the work that I express as my own voice. But I hope this give you a picture of what happened during the 80s and 90s.
Okay, thank you, Phaptawan, for narrating that kind of the moment, the kind of some of the ideas and thinking and experiences that led to the creation of Manifesto. And I think that, since you kind of in some ways handed things off to Nitya and Varsha, at this point, Varsha, can I introduce you and kind of ask you to kind of tell us a little about the kind of development from that point in the 90s forward?
Yeah, hello. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you all at AAA for this wonderful work. It's interesting that slide about the exhibition, the Juan Miro exhibition at Chulalongkorn University, because it seems our paths crossed without us meeting, because I had just about arrived in Bangkok at that time, and I remember seeing that exhibition and actually then becoming really good friends with Rachada Thanapon, who was the main person at Chulalongkorn Gallery. And she introduced me to Nitya, saying, there's this woman's exhibition being planned, and maybe it's of interest to you. And I met Nitya after that. I didn't know anyone in Bangkok when I moved there. I actually made my way to Chulalongkorn University, and I sort of went and asked them if they would let me in as a visiting artist who wanted to do printmaking. And from there on, I started to get to know a lot of people who were active in the Thai art scene, and meeting Nitya. So the first So meeting Nitya, she immediately told me about Womanifesto, and I asked me if I would be interested, and I said, of course, yes. And then we kind of would meet up every now and again, and we'd say, well, okay, what's going to happen now? And she said, you know, I'm the only one here now who's working on it, so it's taking some time. So I said, well, can I help in any way? And she said, well, would you be willing to do so? And I said, yes, of course. And that's how I started to get involved. This is in 1996.
Yeah.
So that's how we brought the first Womanifesto together. So one of the things which was very clear from the very beginning, how we worked together was really very, I mean, there's always been this kind of flow in the way we've done things. And it was just about what came naturally to you, and also what you were able to do, you know, what was achievable. And so we, you know, we worked together. It was at Ban Chao Phraya Gallery and Concrete House. So there was that sort of continuity from Tradisection, which took place at Concrete House. And of course, with Chantavipa Apisuk and Chumpon Apisuk, big, you know, the big supporters of Womanifesto, wanting it to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, this was all, I mean, Tradisection, I mean, took place at a very specific moment, right? Because it was International Women's Day, and it was also at a moment when there was the conference that was taking place in Beijing. So it seemed like there was a lot of energy. And one of the things I was wondering about is if you could talk about, you know, that context, the kind of maybe more kind of Asian-wide context for that was kind of, you know, focusing on women artists and women artists exhibitions.
Well, I think one thing we realized was that we didn't really have very many reference points of women artists exhibitions. Certainly there was this big gathering happening in Beijing, and hence, you know, it was planned that the first Womanifesto would actually open on International Women's Day. I think that there was, because I kind of arrived there when already there was this group of women who kind of had come together. And there were also people who had met at the first Chiang Mai social installation, Aramayani and Nilufar Akmut, and they were already part of that, included in that group, though they were not in Bangkok. And then getting some more names being added to it as we heard about certain artists. Chumpon Apisuk might have mentioned Tari Ito, who, you know, we ended up inviting. So it's certainly the Beijing event, probably in the back of our minds, you know, made it apparent how there were these possibilities of gathering in a bigger group form and expanding the conversation in many ways to learn about each other's practice and their realities, and, you know. So we, you know, we didn't specifically tie up with Beijing, the Beijing event, or, you know, but I think in some ways we ended up referencing it, or, you know, it was inspiring us at, you know, somewhere along the line, to get this gathering together. I mean, there were also other things, you know, because I would then hear things like, oh, so what's happening about that women's exhibition, you know, and I'd say, yeah, you know, we're working on it, might get delayed. And then I would hear things like, oh, you know, these women can never get it together. So this was a great impact.
Fighting word.
Yeah, this was like, oh yeah, right.
And I think you prepared some images as well. Should we take a look at those?
Yes, sure. I would just move on to what happened subsequently. So what was the main thing about the first Womanifesto gathering, and what was so refreshing, I guess, for us, was that we were coming from wherever we were coming from, you know, with our own set of concerns and our own backgrounds and histories, and the conversations that took place outside the gallery actually became very potent. And very exciting in that, you know, we really wanted to know more and more and more about each other. So by the time and then that's when the decision was made to, yes, we've got to meet biannually. We can't wait for others to organize or be invited, be curated. We have to do it for ourselves. And so this decision to start thinking about the next event, it's, you know, at the first event. So when the second event came around, it grew much bigger. And I wanted, you know, I wanted to show this slide because I just, you know, what I said about the gatherings in our homes, also how the kind of friendships and the bonds grew deeper out of that, because, you know, you've got Amanda Heng, third from the right, you've got Tari Ito, you've got Sanja Ivekovic from Croatia there. And subsequently, they ended up organizing events which some of us were invited back to. So Amanda Heng organized Women About Women, or she was part of the organizing team. It was curated by somebody at Singapore Art Museum. Mm-hmm. And she ended up inviting Nitya, Tari, Aramayani, and myself for that. And then Tari Ito, so that Women About Women happened actually in 1998, so soon after the first Womanifesto. And then Women Breaking Boundaries was organized by a network called WAN, Women Art Network, mm-hmm. From Tokyo. And Tari Ito was a big part of that. And she ended up inviting some of us for that to Tokyo. And what was interesting about how they were a cross-section of women. They weren't just artists, but, you know, there were housewives in there, there were activists in there. There were all kinds of women who were part of that network. And so the exhibition consisted of all these different voices. So it kind of became like a really potent meeting point in many ways. These kind of, I'd say, the off gatherings or the hangout time became a very potent time. And yeah, and the conversations that that went on, you know, and I think the question in a way was how to make those visible, how to look for strategies to actually, yeah, having a gathering biannually was one. Two was to actually do it from our point of view, do it from what we really wanted to talk about, or what we thought was relevant to us, and not to be dismissed as, you know, women being mere dabblers, or these were just women's issues that we were talking about. So yeah, so can we go to the next slide? So the other great, other really important meeting point was text and subtext, which you mentioned. And this was, of course, a much more formal, compared to how we looked at ourselves, formally curated, you know, in Oulu Gallery, and then traveling from Stockholm, Oslo, Denmark, to Taiwan and Beijing, I think, and Australia, I think. It traveled quite widely, but again, this was a very rare opportunity to actually come across women coming from women artists from different places. And again, it became, you know, there were people who, of course, we got to know each other, such as Tarito Aramayani from Womanifesto, but then, you know, I met Judy Freya when she showed about Cafe in Bangkok, and, you know, we become good friends. But this was kind of so a re-meeting, but also it was meeting new people like Yin Shu-chen, Hiroko Inoue from Japan, and Keiko Se, who the photograph actually is from Stockholm. And you've got Bingwei, second from the left, Yin Shu-chen, myself, and Keiko Se. And Keiko Se subsequently moved. She was living in Prague at that time, and she moved to Bangkok, where she is. And she also became part of Womanifesto in the No Man's Land project as a sort of an overall advisor for it, and a participant in the Procreation Post-Creation project. So, and this is where I also met Womali for the first time, which turned out to be, for me, a very significant connection in terms of, yeah, how things developed a bit later, and yeah, where the conversations led. Next, please. So around the same time, we're talking, all of this is in early, I mean, from 1998 to 2000, Sanja Ivekovic organized this conference in Dubrovnik, and she asked if I would be willing to come and present about Womanifesto and you know, the story. What had happened before this was she had actually put me in touch with Katie Deepwell, who you see seated second from the left, the editor and founder of En Paradoxa. And that was my first ever essay that I wrote on Womanifesto, which was published in En Paradoxa, and it was on the 1999 event. So this was a chance to actually meet Katie and others, Hillary Robinson, a lot of the artists from former Yugoslavia, of course, and Western Europe as well, but the artists from Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Estonia, we at some stage or the other, we ended up inviting them back into Womanifesto. Katie also was very interested in she was very pleased to have a writing coming out of Southeast Asia on and getting to know about a women's event like Womanifesto, and she asked if she mentioned that she would be really interested to know other writers. And I remember that I subsequently introduced her to May Claudette, who then started to also contribute to En Paradoxa. So I think that kind of led to, you know, many things opening up. And I also started, she said, oh, you were born in Uganda. And we started talking about that. And I said, yes, I really would like to meet some artists from there. And she told me about Lillian Nabulime, who then I contacted, and we were part of one project together in Berlin. And then we were planning Procreation, Post-Creation at that time. And I invited Lillian and said, would you please introduce artists from your network in Africa? So suddenly there was this momentum, actually, without actually being aware of it, but, you know, the network was just growing. Next one, please. So Procreation Post-Creation, as you know, the publication, I mean, this was interesting how it came about, because this is in 2003, in between, we had 2001, the workshop on Bunbandan Farm, which I'll talk about a bit later. But what was interesting about the whole way of working, in a way, was how it was very much to do with going with the flow. So the project on the farm was really after the exhaustion of the 1999 event, where we had a huge number of artists. We really did think that we would be a small group just getting into a train and going away. And that's how we got introduced to this farm through a common artist friend, Maitri, whose family owned the farm. And we did the workshop there. And for procreation post-creation, Nitya was married, expecting her first child. And then it was this question of, so what are we going to be doing next? And I said, oh, well, you know, it has to be something we can manage. I can manage if I have to on my own. But we did invite others, whoever was available to help. And in this case, Preena Nana, one of the contributors of Womanifesto many a time, joined me to manage this project. And it was literally, in my mind, it was something like, well, what's possible is something, you know, to a strategy to sort of look back at how things were achieved. And, you know, mail art came to my mind because I thought, well, now we have email. So how about email art? And so literally the call went out, shared via people's lists. It was shared in Ann Paradoxa. And, you know, people were, anybody who wanted to join could join the project. So that's how procreation, and then we just, we designed the box. Each work that was received was designed on a single sheet of paper. And then we had this launch evening planned for it, where we exhibited the contents. And then there was, you know, video screenings and performances presented, and a really successful evening, actually. We had a lot of visitors. Next. So at the same time, we set up a website. And so the natural progression was to get into a web project. And these started getting bigger and bigger. So we had 88 participants in procreation post-creation. There were 65 here. And again, I worked with Catherine Olston, who is Australian, but was living in Chiang Mai at that time. She and I worked together on bringing this web project together. It's still on the website. You can see it. Things are a little bit jumbled up, needs tidying up, but in the main, it's there. So you can actually visit it. And by this time, I think by the time actually procreation post-creation, because we started getting also works from men, and how could we, you know, not have them in? I mean, this was the whole point, that us women are going to organize things which men would want to join. And so for this, we made a decision that we would actually have, not quite equal representation, but we would invite artists, male artists who you know, we thought were doing interesting works. Next. So going back to 2001, and then I bring in 2008, the residency, because they both happened in the same location, Bun Bandan Farm. I mean, the reason why I actually chose this image, because I really wanted to show how this creek and this, again, this hanging out time was so important for things to develop. And I think this was also, I think at least, this was also a kind of a strategy where you take the pressure off of having to perform or having to do things, and you let things emerge, you let conversations develop. So the 2001 workshop, you know, we had this very dynamic kind of setting in the main sala on the farm, where, you know, a lot of artisans were coming in, and then we were just interacting with them. And actually one of the things that was outlined in the proposal to the artists was that you do not have to make work. And the focus really was on this kind of conversations and germinating ideas, and also on workshops with schools, and then later on for the residency also 2 colleges, the students. So it was really about that kind of not the community. It wasn't like the artist community was meeting up with another community. It was not that. It was that we were all together forming a community. And how do you go about that? That was really more the thing. And how do you start conversations? There was also this whole intergenerational thing. So how does knowledge get passed down in this rural area where mainly the gaze is towards the cities, and the young people, moment they finish their education, are probably thinking of how they could get to Bangkok and work there, but to see the richness, to kind of bring out the richness of within your own environment. And yes, like I said, this handing down of knowledge and skills. Next. So going back to meeting Wumali, I had been in constant touch with her, and this really resounded. This was in 2007, which was before the 2008 Womanifesto residency, and she curated Artist Environment, a cultural action on the Tropic of Cancer. And she invited me as an artist in residence for it. And I had absolutely no idea. Actually, I was supposed to go somewhere else, to a fishing community along the coast. I don't remember the name. But I got placed in Xingkan purely because my host in Xingkan could speak perfect English and I would not be lost. So this was kind of also very interesting because I prepared a lot for the other place, but I was here. But I liked this kind of, like I said, going with the flow situation, because I think it enables a lot of things, and you never arrive at any kind of preset ideas, but you really take in what is there, and then that becomes your kind of starting point. So I found that really interesting as well, about how Wumali, certainly through her other projects, had actively started to do these big projects within communities. And, in this entire county of Chiayi, where for over 2 years, she was successfully bringing in artists and placing them in various locations, whether it was in the tea gardens or down, Xinggang is a very well-known place for its ceramics, and also the Matsu temple, which is a very famous temple in Taiwan, and, other farming communities all around the place. So that was, again, you had the sort of autonomy to plan what you wanted to do and how you wanted to do it. And I thought that was also, for me, it was really, really inspiring. Based on a conversation with Wumali prior to getting invited for this, she'd started a project called 23.5, planting trees on the Tropic of Cancer. And she told me about it, and I was so taken up by that idea that I actually did go to Bhuj along with a friend of mine here. We went to Bhuj on a train, and we worked with 3 schools, and we planted trees together. So, next, please. And then I just will briefly talk about this project, which came about much later in 2010, 2011, and it came out of this conversation with Wumali. So, we were, again, all of those things were resonating with me. And so it all went into this project. And it was really this thing of bringing a community of people together of all kinds of backgrounds: scientists, botanists, birders, migratory bird experts, forestry department. Next. And there is a blog. I can share the link with you. You can actually go and look at all the kinds of activities. It was involving 7 schools around the lake. and these village schools where they have absolutely no art materials. So I think just introducing a sketchbook and colors was, you know, significant. But then it went further into mapping, getting them to tell how they saw their place, their connection with each other around the lake and with the lake. And then experts who came in to talk about migratory routes. Dr. Jitendra Gavli, head of Community Science Center, was who I collaborated with. And then there are these forestry department beat officers who all became part of our workshops. Next. So coming in back to Baroda, I think, you know, one of the things has been always this thing of talking about Womanifesto, presenting about it, giving it as much focus and exposure as possible in order not to be made invisible. Because it did feel that way for a while, that we were, and it still does at times, that we are not considered in some ways. So when I moved back to Baroda, I was invited to do a talk at my own alma mater, which I gave on Womanifesto. And then this is a very recent image of a weaving workshop with this absolutely amazing weaver, Rajiben from Kutch, who recycles plastic. And this was, I show this slide because this was in late September. We were finally allowed to move around freely. And we were already talking about the next Womanifesto, which was about how important it was to gather face to face. And so this workshop kind of, for me, resonated a lot in being able to finally, even just a small group of us, be together. And then two of the people who were in this workshop, Rashmi Mala and Ananya Patel, are who I ended up, along with two other women, for the next project, which is happening in December. I think I'm out of time probably by now.
Well, thank you, Varsha. That was great to hear the kind of the shifts and transitions. And I'd love to get back to the question of the gathering in December, which sounds very intriguing. But mindful of the time, I was just wondering if Eileen, if you have anything you would like to add about the kind of the movements or kind of like evolution in feminist practice and over this time.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's here. I noticed there are a few Filipinos who are not necessarily in Manila who are listening in. And thank you for AAA for taking on the peg, which is Backwards in Neighborhoods, for being open to it. I'd like to say a little bit about that before going on. Apart from about Backwards in Neighborhoods, apart from Manifesto's later shift towards enabling residencies, my thinking upon this title also in a way was referencing the then perceived invisibility, which Varsha does mention in art's historical narratives as the discourse on contemporary art within Southeast Asia was beginning to take shape. So something that's to me, from a research and art historical perspective, that makes Womanifesto distinct is that, well, yeah, it works on different tracks at the same time while still pursuing the concern for visibility. There's this very obvious desire to depart from what most biennales are about. So maybe that's something I can spend a little time on. And just to point out a few things that I think distinguish it and that also resonate in other initiatives in the region to some extent. First of all, there's the very obvious artist or self-initiated aspect of Womanifesto, the very casual path crossings, which both Phaptawan and Varsha have already spoken of. And the Varsha calls it the flow, but for some artists that would refer to a more process-based form of work, as well as a very relational and dialogical mode of engaging with people. So that to me sets it apart from, yeah, after realizing how, in a way, successful they became after the first installment, and how overwhelming that was, and how they stepped back and stepped away from the center, so to speak, and avowedly decided to chill, and not force themselves to produce, get off the train, so to speak, become more agile and listen to what's happening on the ground, which does lend the initiative the autonomy that Varsha also mentions. So yeah, maybe do you mind if I slip into the PowerPoint at this time, John?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Elena, can I have that? Okay. So just in an attempt to also situate where I'm coming from, I wanted to say that we do never enter into our work as if it's a vacuum, and the work that I've been doing in regard to research and writing is built upon many other women scholars who have come before me. So as you noticed several times, Claudette May the Twin was already mentioned. So May is a colleague, of course, and was very instrumental in making the introductions for myself to Phaptawan and to Varsha. Okay, could you go to the next slide, please? Someone who is in the webinar listening is Imelda Kahipendaya, and that object on top of the books that I'm showing is actually from her. I wanted to bring up how there are really very obvious parallels that was happening in the region, although they may not have been conversing very directly at the early stages. So this work is from the venture of Kasibulan, Kababaihan sa Sining at Bagong Sibol na Kamalayan, or Women in Art and Emerging Consciousness, which was established in 1987. So they've done quite a few things since coming together, but one of their projects was working with, I'm not sure if it's just Paite, but also I think Pakil paper mache makers, who they had convinced to just try or discover making these objects in a way, in a sense, defying what the market was asking for, which was Santa Claus and all these very Western iconic laden characters. So they had this series where they were reintroducing or focusing attention on historical heroines. This one in particular was the women sewers who were part of creating the narrative of nation through sewing the Philippine flag. Oh, there's a buzz. Sorry, just a moment. Can you turn that off? Is the bus gone now? I hope so. Let me know if that's still a problem. It's still there. Oh, so it's not me because there's nothing going on in my side of the room anymore. Anyway, if we could go on to the next slide. Yeah. All right. So just in the interest of showing you what kind of intersections or crossings of paths were happening, in the course of preparing for this talk, I really dug into my trove and discovered that all three of us, Phaptawan, Varsha, and myself, had written for Consultas P. Varsha has been on the editorial team for the longest time, but so there were these instances where people would sometimes meet or not meet, but have these conversations. Could you go to the next? So that's Phaptawan's work on my left, and of course you already saw that image of no man's land from Varsha's talk. Next slide, please. So this is just to show you that there were parallels. Of course, Me the Twin has been in direct touch with Womanifesto to a larger extent than I have. But here, this is an image from the essay on Kasibulan written for Control Plus P, in which both Phaptawan and Varsha's essays appear. So just to show you the parallels. In this case, I think they were working with Filipino migrant workers. Please go on. Next slide, please. All right. So just to further, again, situate where we're at this point. I don't know where you might exactly be, but here in the Philippines, we're still pretty much in terror mode, being frightened to stay in. And I see our options as like a series of choices. We can stay within this narrow view. This is a shot of a playground very near to my house. Next slide, please. Further apart, we can think about venturing much further. Next slide, please. Or we can keep to where we're usually at, where we're comfortable. And I'd like to call your attention to a phrase which I pick up from Phaptawan's essay in Control P, where she talks about the comfort zone of awkwardness. And Varsha's own term in the same issue was dislocated. So these are just random images of a dress shop that's turned to selling masks, homemade tofu and soy shop I discovered, and people who are selling like quick meals. Next slide, please. Or we might think of our neighborhoods farther from where we live at the moment. So this is not where I live, but I tend to think that the kind of work that Womanifesto does allows this kind of expanding of imagination and thinking, where, of course, given the pandemic, there's a particular hyperlocality of mode of work that we're forced into, but I see the agility and quick ability to shift that Womanifesto seems to underpin what Womanifesto does, despite there are certain gap years, so to speak. But I think that's what will allow it to thrive amidst this very real contingencies. And I think we're going to the last slide. And in that case, we're able to, I just wanted to pick up a phrase from Claudette May the Twin, where she talks about, in a talk she did recently at the University of Sydney, where she's talking about affecting a more planetary rather than global focus, where we're able to cross into thinking about others, not just humans, and living things around us that allow us to keep living, working, and how that I think the neighborliness that is suggested by Womanifesto's venturing out is very much in keeping with that. So maybe I'll stop there so that we can do a more proper conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Eileen, for that contribution. I think that there's a lot that you all raised in terms of what you presented on and spoke about. But one thing that I was interested in is this kind of question of crossing territories, Eileen, that you brought up, because it seems like, it's something that took place. All of you kind of were either kind of evoked it or lived it in some ways, right? I mean, Phaptawan, you talked about the way that you were an artist from Thailand who was working in the kind of Thai mural tradition, but then also exhibiting in Paris and being based in Australia now. And Varsha, you talked about how in some ways you had arrived in Bangkok in the 90s, but and then kind of participated in that scene over there, but then also kind of participated in various initiatives and exhibitions that took place around the world, right? And that was partly what you talked about. I was wondering if you could talk, maybe venture a few words about kind of, what that kind of perspective, how that kind of maybe changed your understanding of feminism, and to have that kind of mixing of feminism with this kind of crossing territories, or kind of like the planetary, maybe, a dimension of feminism. Does that make sense? Or because it seems like it was a very kind of planetary feminism that all of you were practicing. You were bringing artists from all over the world to Bangkok, to Thailand, and also you were kind of going out and kind of participating in that as well.
Are you asking any particular one, or
any of you? Yeah. I think all of you have interesting things, would have interesting things to say about it.
For me, it was really interesting. Soon after, I think the 1999 event, I got asked by an artist who'd become a curator and a writer, who had moved to Bangkok. And he suddenly turned around after perhaps we'd done a presentation of Womanifesto or something, and he said to me, "Oh, so now you're a feminist." And it shocked me, because firstly that he'd said that, and secondly because I'd never thought about it, because I was just doing what I was doing, what was important to me as a woman and as an artist. And if that merited me being called a feminist, then maybe that's what it was about, was my way of thinking. And I'd only come across women, and especially amongst the artists, who were all of similar thinking, wherever they were coming from. And that it was really about our voices, and really about what we wanted to talk about, and how we saw things, how we wanted to present things. And I think this was just reinforced every time you were part of any exhibition or an event or a symposium or whatever that you got invited for. I mean, perhaps, we were in a bubble, of like-minded people. So I think that we were not working individually, or it felt like you were this big gang.
Yeah, but I mean, okay, so maybe you were like-minded, but at the same time, it was one of the things that struck me about Manifesto, certainly, as an initiative, was that it gathered a lot of different kinds of people, and even Section, I think, it wasn't a kind of, where it started with Section wasn't about maybe a politics of respectability, right? Because I mean, Section was kind of a benefit for sex workers. And, in Manifesto in 1999, you invited Don Ladawan Pasar, and there was a kind of, and Tar Ito participated. So it wasn't just kind of, like a very respectable, like middle-class woman that was being kind of presented as the kind of face of Manifesto. It was in some ways a very diverse range of femininity, of different kinds of women that were able to participate, not just the nationality, but the kind of the subject positions that women could occupy was very varied, right? I mean, Phaptawan, I think, something that you brought up was the way that, you were, when you started, you were kind of breaking a barrier, right? As the first woman to work in the kind of the religious mural, the painting tradition. And I was wondering if you could say a little about, what, because it seemed like that caused a certain amount of scandal, or a certain amount of anxiety on the part of men, maybe.
Well, it's for me, it's a long story from childhood, because I lived in a temple as young as when I was 7, actually, and that's when I experienced firsthand that I was different, because I lived there with my in a nunnery house where the nun was gone. So I think I was the only woman. With my dad in another, in another complex, and 2 brothers. And because the manner and everything, in the temple, I was singled out. So I was conscious that I was different. Then, as I explained earlier, that from rented house to houses and houses, and I mixed with girls my age. We went to school, and then we saw them drop out. And if I went to high school with all-girl high school, and junior high school is the the cut that we either go on, and the aim is to university, which I was. But then a friend who, a friend of mine who got like over 90% in each subject, she dropped out. It's because she has arranged marriage planned for her future, and that was that kind of thing that made me conscious that in a way I question all the time about why is this, why is that, and most of the time it's about why it happened that way.
Yeah.
Now to the tradisection, like I said, it was the first time that I voiced out a woman in temple. By the way, although I was the first woman, one of the first, if there is one before me, I did not see, or it was not recorded. There was a scandal before that then, because when my sister, who graduated from fine art school, and I wanted her to, to have a training school, or went to. So I asked a fellow artist who was former painter in my father's team before he passed away, and the way I jumped into this his footstep, because he left. He passed away when there was a project, half completed. And it's only for one letter written with his handwriting from his dead bed, and he said, "Luk Chang," which means little elephant. That was my name. Please complete this project, and if you stay in a group, you can continue on. And so I did not feel pressure to do that, because I like what I just enjoy doing things, and it was like naturally I stepped in. Back to my sister. So I asked one of my colleagues in the group who had actually a temple project before my first project, and so I think he was pressured by me to take my sister, and only to be stopped by the head, the abbot of the monk and the temple committee, and saying that she cannot go on over the scaffolding, which is higher than head, and the scaffolding. Coincidentally, this committee entered the temple under the scaffolding in which my sister was working on. So she was asked to remove from the place and never to return again. And it's obviously it's my colleague's project. So, before I left, I went to see the abbot, and I said, well, before I go, yeah, I happily take her away. Because it's your project. And I look at my colleague and I said, just before I go, can I ask, I have questions to ask the abbot first, can you paint? And the committee second, can you paint? You don't have to answer, my sister can paint. And then I left. With all that, that kind of question, and with tradisection, with the voice that I can voice out. The temple, the mural painting in Buddhist temple also have the narrative of something that did not really represent my life. So maybe that is I think the first experience that I have women's voice. And the other thing is, it's interesting, in tradition section, I met for that May dating for the first time. She was there on the research trip, residency for a long, I think for a year. We were introduced by Jumpon, and to which May paid attention on the temple project. By that time, I had like about 4 or 5 temples. So I produced 1 temple a year, and May follow me to every single project across Thailand. And she mentioned, on day 2 or day 3, she said that Phaptawan, your action alone is in the context of feminism. Feminism was an idea, and I did not associate with myself as feminist. Still, I have to educate myself about the notion of feminism. Yeah. I still yet to learn. I don't know where I locate myself in such a huge subject. May later invited me to the exhibition, like 3 years after the first exhibition of Manifesto. And there, I think Eileen involved with that project as well. And that project, I just talk about it briefly. It's called Women Imagining Women, and it shows work of 4 women artists. And Rayamayani was one from Indonesia, and 2 other artists from Vietnam, and myself. So May had something to say in the catalog, and I think, if Eileen want to elaborate further, then maybe she's the better person to talk about it. Yeah. So in terms of across the the planet, and how I met women artists through tradisection. Afterward, shortly after tradisection, there was an event at my social installation where I met Amanda Heng. She she put her work up called Missing. I think that was Missing. The one which show Girl Baby Dress. And that was also, that exposed myself to other women artists who talk about things that happen to women. Yeah. I don't know if that associates with feminism or whatever. More direct to me than the narrative of the temple.
Yeah.
So to
So, you know, you brought up women imaging women, and I think earlier Varsha talked about women, and also women breaking boundaries. And it seemed that, and subtext and subtext, and I think that there was this kind of critical mass of events and exhibitions that were taking place. And Eileen, I don't know, do you have anything you'd like to kind of say about that moment?
Yeah, I think they were coalescing precisely because of the, you know, the instigation of the UN, and yeah, the declarations about the decade of women. And while I would agree that that did play a lot into why these things were happening to some extent, because you know how it is, funding agencies will also reprogram to a certain extent to align with that. But I would really also like to underline how there's a particular internal logic and rhythm to the organizing that happens when it's artists that are at the forefront.
Yeah.
Which is why a lot, oh, I mean, the strategy of Manifesto was to go, you know, very personal, casual, as opposed to very pre-planned and rigid. But just also in response to your question about crossing territories, I also wanted to bring up just an observation how, I mean, to my mind, that happens, for instance, in the case of Phaptawan, who crossed over from working in temples to going into a studio, and then by engaging with Manifesto, she would come back into a more public arena again. And of course, now that's all up, all changed. But so there's that. There's the breaking of like a psychological and social barrier that I mean to reference. Also, of course, in a way defying of stereotypes, which Phaptawan did mention. But when, as my understanding of the planetary as it was posited, was that we're talking about a much more intersectional kind of feminism, and also eco-feminist in this regard, which wasn't quite the case when all this was beginning. And if even in the experience of Kasibulan, which is the Philippine kind of parallel, these kind of ambivalences about whether one is a feminist or not, or what kind of a feminist are you, these were very real, you know, in a way, conflict or process points that continue to hound organizations. So there's also a very like generational aspect to it, I think, that we might have to deal with, because I'm looking at much younger formations now who don't quite have that ambivalence anymore. They're quite more upfront about identifying themselves, but at the same time, there's a different mode of work involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that shift is something that you can also see, right? I moving from the 90s into the 2000s, even just the projects that were evoked by Varsha, you know, where at first in the 90s, it's kind of very straightforward. It's like, okay, here's an exhibition of women artists, or here's a kind of a gathering of women artists to talk about their experience. But then I think, you know, with the projects that, you know, Varsha kind of evokes maybe about a decade later, it's kind of much more about inserting women artists into a community and then kind of working with a certain kind of ethos, right? And that kind of signals a kind of a different operating or kind of operating method, but also a different outlook in terms of what's effective in terms of the politics or the ethos of feminism. Yeah. Let's see, I don't know if we have any questions from the audience, but we're almost out of time. So let's see, okay, so no questions. So any last comments from any of you? Varsha, do you want to say, oh, do you actually, yes, I do want to ask. So Womanifesto gatherings this year. So you mentioned this a little, you talked a little about this in your presentation, but so is it still kind of under wraps, or is it something that you can kind of tell us a little more in terms of what?
No, I think we can share what's happening until now. So it came out of, the idea was that we, between Nitya and myself, a conversation about us wanting to meet up at the end of this year. And then with the whole COVID situation, and then saying, okay, well, let's see what's possible. We'll decide in 2 months, in the next 2 months. And of course, it's becomes, after 2 months, it's more of the same. And then Nitya, actually, in the last conversation we had before thinking about this gathering project was, but Varsha, why don't we just do it? You do it where you are, I do it where I am. And then I said, yes, and then Phaptawan can do it where she is, and we can ask a couple more people who've been involved with Womanifesto, like Nilufer in London, Carla Saxe in Berlin, and then as it so happened, Lena Eriksson in Basel, who's not actually being directly involved with Womanifesto, but was quite active. She visited the open day in the 2008 residency. She's subsequently talked about Womanifesto a lot amongst her community in Basel. So we approached these people and said, here is an idea that you keep it really local. You actually do what is possible. If it's possible for you to meet, in an open space with 2 or 3 or 4 people, then do so. If it's only the 2 of you sitting in a room, then do so. If it's even 2 of you talking at a distance, then do so. But however, a face-to-face meeting, and you are at freedom, each location is at freedom to decide how they do it and what they do with it and what they want to talk about and how they share it, how they show it. If it's possible for you, you want to exhibit what you've done, or you just want to document it. And I'm in the process now to actually set up a blog where everybody can upload what they're going to be doing, either as it happens or afterwards. So December is a time when these gatherings will happen on Nitya's farm in Udon Thani, Sydney with Phaptawan, myself in Baroda in the courtyard of my studio, an outdoor space where I gather 6 women, and Carla Saxe in Berlin and Basel, and hopefully Nilufer in London. So this is the gathering. Okay.
So we'll stay tuned about that. And then we actually do have one last question from one of the audience members, Imelda Kajipe and Daya. Okay. One thank you from Durban. No question, but like to thank you. I can hear everything. And from Hamburg. And then the question from Imelda Kajipe and Daya. Does the Womanifesto project try to balance its mindfulness of visibility with the women artists' effectiveness in the backyards or vernacular impact? And if it does try to balance these kind of questions of, I think I'm interpreting a little, questions of visibility and effectiveness, how does it do so? So.
Eileen, do you want to tell us what you think?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm thinking though that the gatherings that will be happening this December will show whether the low key or the scaled down will indeed yield that kind of, I mean, if it's viable to balance those desires. But yeah, like I said, because I see the way Manifesto works as being very agile. I think it's very possible that can be done. Maybe her question is, how have you done it in the past?
How have we balanced in the past? I've never thought about that.
I mean, yeah, it seems like maybe one thing is that kind of when, if anything, it wasn't so much about a balance as a kind of like a flow or a shift, right? It starts off being all about visibility and kind of increasing visibility and representation into something which is much more mindful of context and kind of investing in that, in the backyard, in the neighborhood in some ways, and thinking about that kind of more, you know, not exactly local because it's still international, but yeah.
Yeah, and also, you know, it was a conscious decision to actually decentralize and get away from this center of art making and showing and all of that. And to actually, and also this thing of you know, at that time, I remember this conversation about this high art and craft, and really completely actually, not completely, but actually kind of looking down upon, or the art, you know, the artist versus the artisan.
Yeah.
And this is in our communities. I mean, I come from, you know, a place where craftsmanship and artisanship is a big thing.
Yes.
So, so, you know, these were things which we were really trying to, and also choosing this region of Thailand, northeastern Thailand, which is kind of looked down upon, and, you know, and sort of taking on those challenges in a way, and saying, well, let's go really have a real conversation now.
Yeah. And it sounds like in 2020, there will be kind of real conversations taking place all over. And then kind of joining back. So no Zoom meetings, Varsha. I'm kind of a little disappointed as part of Womanifesto.
Well, we might, you know, each location can choose if you're going to set up a Zoom meeting or a live feed. I thought that when I finally do a gathering, which will be a one evening event, one afternoon evening event, I could actually set up a live feed of what was going on. So, you know, we will be the 6 of us in one space, and then there will be a live feed that people can actually attend. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that maybe is a good place to end on. Stay tuned for Manifesto Gathering 2020. Here we come. And thank you so much to all of you, Phaptawan, Varsha, and Eileen, for joining us tonight for this conversation. And thank you to the audience for joining us as well, both on Zoom and on Facebook. And stay tuned for more from Womanifesto and from Asia Art Archive. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you.